person interesting that visited China recently is John Mearsheimer.
Mm,
So he was, I believe, invited by Tsinghua
yeah.
University to give a speech,
Mm,
and then followed with some panel discussions. So he's, I would say, kind of a controversial figure in China because there
mm,
are plenty of people online very critical of him because he has
mm,
been talking about contain
yeah.
China.
Mm,
But when he was there in Tsinghua University, the students and the people who were hosting him, they were all very warm towards him.
yeah.
Um, I think part of it is he believes that containing China is necessary for the U.S., but he also not blaming China for what China
Yeah.
is doing, building up
Yeah.
its military, its industry, those sort of thing. So, is it fair to say that he is in the school of this Thucydides trap thinking? Is that kind of his thinking that he agrees with this theory? Can we say
I
that?
think I think he is a more sophisticated thinker than be simply following mechanically the Thucydides trap type thing. By the way, I mean I should say something. I mean we discussed Mearsheimer some time ago,
Mm-hmm.
and the important thing to say about Mearsheimer is he has a theory of international relations,
Mm-hmm.
and I've explained why I don't agree with his perspectives on the
Mm-hmm.
relationship between China. I think he doesn't, I think, understand that there are differences between China and the way in which the European powers behave and have historically behaved. I think he, assumes that the
Mm-hmm.
whole world works in that kind of way, and I think it doesn't. And I think Chinese history shows that. But he has none of that antagonism
Mm-hmm.
to a country. He just it's just that he thinks that in international relations are always about power. Ultimately, it's about that they're about power relations,
Mm-hmm.
which is a very common view, by the way. I mean, so he doesn't come to China with any antipathy to China. And I mean, I should say this. I mean, I've discussed China with him,
Mm-hmm.
and he even told me once that actually, he's aware about him being. This was before his
Yeah.
recent visit, that he's very, very well received in China, and
Mm-hmm.
that people like him there, and that
Mm-hmm.
he's taken very seriously in China. In fact, he didn't say this to me. I'm not putting words into his mouth. He didn't say that he's taken more seriously in China than he is in the United States. But I almost
But
got
it's true.
that sense that that is what he
Yeah.
thinks. Anyway, but
Mm-hmm.
anyway, there we go. So, but the Thucydides trap is something that is being harped on and talked about in the West in terms of the relations between the United States and China all the time. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
every single newspaper in Britain has published articles, not just one article, lots of articles about this. You read about it in the United States also. I should say the Americans even more because classics studies are much more prevalent in the US than they are in Europe any longer, surprising as that may seem. But lots of Americans, especially Americans in the military for some reason, seem to be very familiar with and very interested in ancient Greek and Roman history and what the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers and historians wrote. So
Before you
there is a
stop,
go on.
first of all, sorry to
Sorry.
interrupt you. Can you explain what Thucydides
Yeah,
trap
yeah,
is?
I will absolutely.
Okay.
Let me explain exactly what it is. So
Yeah.
this comes from Greek history, and you've got to understand that the Greece is a very small part of the world. Um, in in Western civilization, it has an absolutely disproportionate degree of importance because Greece was the first part of Europe to actually become civilized and to develop a proper civilization and a very powerful civilization with tremendous philosophy and intellectual things and all sorts of things. Now, around the time of the Warring States, at the time of the Zhou dynasty, I mean, we're talking about the equivalent period is the Zhou
Mm-hmm.
dynasty uh, um, in China. Um, the ancient Greek world possessed two great powers. One was Athens,
Mhm.
which is today the capital of Greece. The other was Sparta, which is a city in the south of Greece. Today, if you wanted to go from one to the other, it's a day's drive. I've done it many times, but in the time of the ancient world, these are big distances, and each of them were enormously powerful. Sparta historically had been the more powerful country.
Mhm.
It was the biggest power in Greece. It had the most powerful army, and it had an aristocratic, conservative political system. Athens was the newer, rising power, dynamic. It was a merchant, maritime city. It began to rise. Now, these two cities ended up fighting each other, and there was a prolonged war, which is as important in Greek history as any of the wars between the warring states are for the people of China. And over the course of that war, which Sparta won and Athens lost, a historian appeared who is as important in Greek history as Sima Qian is in China. And this is Thucydides.
Mhm.
Thucydides was an Athenian politician and general. He was a commander of the Athenian forces. He was defeated by the Spartans. He went into exile and he decided that he would write the history of the war. And he used scientific methods to write that history, which were of a quality and a accuracy that it is fair to say no Western historian achieved any time after until the late 19th century. So he is an incredibly important intellectual figure. Now, he wrote this book, which is often referred to as the Peloponnesian War, and it is one of the great texts of ancient Greek civilization. It's one of the key texts, which he describes the war in phenomenal accuracy. And at the beginning, he has a war in which he discusses the causes of the war between Athens and Sparta. And he then gives a long list of the various things that the Athenians and the Spartans argued about, what the one did and what the other did and what they didn't agree with, and all of which eventually led to the war. And then he has this very famous passage in which he said that these are the reasons why these countries said they went to war.
Mhm.
But the underlying reason was the growth of Athenian power and the fear this caused in Sparta. So Sparta had been the more powerful country. Athens was the rising country. The Spartans saw Athenian power increase. That made them afraid, and this led to the war. Now, many people in the West, in fact, it's not just many people, it's the predominant view in intellectual circles, believe that Thucydides was writing a history in which he wanted to set out universal rules about human affairs.
Mhm.
And what he was saying was that in a situation where there are two powers, one is rising relative to the other, that is going to inevitably result in a crisis, and that will lead to a war between the two. So, to use the analogy of recent Western history, Britain used to be the dominant power. It saw Germany rise, and that is why there was wars between Britain and Germany. And
Mhm.
during the Cold War, the US was the dominant power. It looked as if the Soviet Union was going to rise. That was why there was Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. And what they're saying today is it's the same today between the United States and China. The United States is the great power. China is the rising power. there is inevitably going to be a conflict between the two. A war is going to arise because of the rise of Chinese power and the fear this is causing in America. Now, the trouble is, all of these people who say this don't speak Greek. I speak Greek. I am absolutely imbued with Thucydides. And he didn't mean it in that way at all. He was not writing general rules about international affairs. On the contrary, if you read him carefully, he goes out of his way to make clear that always there are choices. There was no reason why Sparta needed to fear Athens or that Athens needed to go to war with Sparta. It was absolutely the result, the product of bad decisions made in both of these countries. He would have completely rejected any suggestion that this is an iron rule that must be applied, right across international relations, because he was a passionate believer, and passionate is not an overstatement, in human agency and in the role of political leaders in making decisions. So he would have said there is no such thing as a Thucydides trap. Talking as if there is simply a way to reject your own responsibility for decisions which are simply going wrong. And he would have looked at the situation today, if he was around today, and he was one of the most intelligent men that we have ever produced in the West, and he would have said, look, there's the United States, there is China, there is no fundamental incompatibility between the two. Yes, there are points of tension, but there is no reason why these can't be negotiated and sorted out and settled peacefully. And there is no iron rule that says that because China is rising, that must mean that America and China must go to war with each other.
This is very interesting. Sounds to me like Thucydides himself would want to avoid Thucydides trap, right? He
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, he, as I said, he was someone. If you read his book, I mean, one of the most interesting things is that he is very, he's not particularly religious. It's one of the strange facts. So he rejects completely any deterministic or mystical approach to history. He says that always human agency in international relations is decisive. And he's repeatedly talking, he often talks about, this political leader, it's wise and statesmanlike. He talks like this about Pericles, the Athenian leader, or Brasidas, the Spartan leader, for example. Others are not so. They're demagogic. They look and create all kinds of problems, and they inspire people to do all sorts of terrible things. And there's a lot of criticism of leaders like this. But what people do, as I said, they take these isolated phrases in Thucydides and they construct entire philosophical systems around him, which is absolutely the view which he would have categorically rejected.
Yeah, the people who are championing for this are the people saying this is unavoidable. This trap,
exactly,
this trap is unavoidable. Whereas he himself want to see things happen differently to avoid that trap. So that's very ironic. I find it very interesting.
It is extremely ironic because a lot of the people who say that that we are in a Thucydides trap, and that a conflict between China and the United States is unavoidable. This is the thing to understand, is that they want a conflict between the United States and China. And they're using Thucydides to say, well, whether you want it or not, it's going to happen. I mean, that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
Which isn't true. It's not what he said at all.
Yeah. Well, then Mearsheimer's view then seems like a kind of like agrees with it somewhat, but then he thinks the way to avoid that is to contain China, to not let China continue to rise, right? That's his solution.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, his view. I mean, that's why I said he's not. I mean, he's far too sophisticated a person to
Mhm.
fall into the error of what we just talked about. I mean, he wants to avoid conflict with China. I think that's the thing to understand about Mearsheimer. His
Mhm.
objective is to avoid war, but he believes that in order to avoid war, you need to practice deterrence and containment.
Mhm.
I think that is wrong. The way to avoid conflict and war is, on the contrary, to practice cooperation and friendship. And I think that is, by the way, much closer to Thucydides' thinking than to one of these nonsense people who invented the Thucydides trap.
It's very interesting. Okay. Now
Yeah.
finally it's clear to me. All right. Um, I mean, I actually thought that was what Thucydides meant, right? That this is
No.
unavoidable. So,
Yes.
okay.
You see, can I just give another example of? I mean,
Yes. Yeah.
there's a Thucydides becomes extremely critical of the policies of his own city of Athens, which becomes increasingly aggressive and increasingly brutal. And there's a very famous incident which he describes in great detail, in which the Athenians crush an island city called Melos, because Melos rebelled against them, and the Athenians came and they killed all the men and they sold all the women and children into slavery. And I mean, it's clear that he's profound. If you read it, he's profoundly shocked by it. He thinks this is terrible and cynical thing. Anyway, he gives the Athenians a quote when they're explaining what they're going to do to the Melians, in which the Athenians tell the Melians that of men we know and of the gods we believe, that the strong do as they will and the weak do as they must. And many people assume that this was Thucydides' own belief. Absolutely not. He's criticizing this because, of course, it's this policy of increasing aggressiveness and brutality that Athens follows, promoted by political leaders in Athens, that he strongly criticizes, which eventually turn the whole of Greece against Athens and lead to its defeat. So, again, this isn't, people are not reading him correctly.
Yeah.